All right, I just want to thank everyone for joining in, signing in. It's about 6:05, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Erin Flaherty. I'm the environmental analyst assigned to review the project from the Mepa office. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of Mepa and the process, and then turn it over to the Mbta to present their presentation on the project. So Mepa review is a pre-permitting process to facilitate disclosure of environmental impacts and help inform state agencies prior to the taking of any state agency action. So for this project, it's a little unique. It doesn't actually exceed any Mepa thresholds outlined in our regulations, but the Mbta's enabling legislation requires that for a system-wide decrease in service of 10% or more, an environmental notification form needs to be submitted. So this remote meeting is an informal meeting, and although the meeting will be recorded and posted on the Mbta's website for the project, comments expressed in the meeting won't be transcribed. The formal way to participate in the Mepa process is to submit written comments to myself, and we can go over the details on how to do that at the end of the presentation. So unless otherwise extended, comments are due in writing on March 2nd, and a certificate would then be issued 10 days later on March 12th. And the certificate doesn't approve or deny a project. It just certifies that the environmental impacts have been adequately disclosed and studied. So now I'll turn it over to the Mbta staff to give you an overview of the project, and then we will open it up to questions. Unless anyone has any questions on the Mepa process itself. All right, I will turn it over to Kat, sorry.
It's coming to me. So
okay.
My name is Andrew Brennan. I'm the Mbta Senior Director for Energy and Environment, and managing this Mepa process for the Forging Ahead plan. I've got a few of my colleagues with me here tonight that I'm going to be turning it over to. First is Kat Benesh. Kat is the Chief of Operations Strategies, and she's been leading up and spearheading most of the Forging Ahead program, and she's going to be taking you through the details of the program and here tonight. I also have Lindsay Heffernan, and Lindsay is the Assistant General Manager for Policy here at the Mbta. And then lastly, I have Anthony Thomas, and he's the Manager of Policy Development and working on these and other programs. As Erin said, we have this deck that we're going to take you through tonight, and Kat's going to describe what is it from Mepa purposes as unusual kind of project. This is atypical for a Mepa project, so we'll take you through it. We're going to be posting this deck tomorrow. We'll have this deck tomorrow on our website, so you'll have access to it. And I believe one of our last slides has the website address where both the ENF can be found, and then tomorrow this deck will be up there as well. So that's, I think the last slide has the URL for this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kat Benesh and let her take it from here.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Erin. And thanks everyone for having us here. I will try to spend no more than 20-25 minutes giving this presentation, so we can save lots of time for any Q&A. And a couple things up front before we even get to the presentation. I think just important just to remind people, and for any of you guys who were potentially in the 11 public meetings in November, December, some of this will sound very familiar. But the first and foremost is just clarifying that the Mbta never wants to reduce service. That is never our goal, and that is always the option of last resort. That we've been working significantly over the past several years trying to improve and be better for riders. And that includes increasing our capital program to more than $1 billion a year, tangible improvements in safety, efficiency, reliability, as well as redesigning and rethinking both our commuter rail system and our bus system. That being said, COVID-19, which really led into Forging Ahead, has significantly changed where and how people travel, which resulted in a significant drop of ridership and fare revenue. And I think the clearest example of that is about a year ago, or probably more than a year ago, pre-COVID, we had 1.3 million trips taken a day on an average weekday on the T. Right now, it's less than a third of that. And even as the fall, we were still running roughly the same service we were a year ago, which means we had empty trains, buses, boats, and vans. And we're trying to think about what's the best way to be both providing the best possible service while also being responsible financial stewards. And so essentially, and we also saw, and I'll talk through this briefly, the drop in ridership has been very different across the modes. So on some commuter rail, it's dropped nearly 90%, yet on some buses, it may have only dropped 40%. So when we think through how to respond to this, it can't be one size fits all. And so given the unequal changes in both our ridership and the budgetary impacts that COVID-19 has had on the system, we went through this process to make sure that we could protect our essential services and the riders that depend on them. So that thinking that really it's our moral obligation to make sure that we can preserve reliable, safe, frequent service for our most transit critical populations, and walk through what that means. And just a reminder, a few other quick things that as part of this, there were no proposed fare increases. And if we did offer a fare increase, it would go through a separate public process. And that finally, these changes as a whole are not meant to be permanent. That we will be restoring and re-adding service, but as we build back, when we take into mind our commuter rail vision and rail transformation and bus network redesign, the system that we build back to will likely look different than what we're operating pre-COVID. So I just wanted to level set some of that because those are, I think, some key overarching points to forging ahead as we go into it. So I'll now walk through the deck, and like I said, I'll try to be brief, but happy to go into more depth if there are any questions for clarification of what this means. So forging ahead is a process the Mbta underwent and is still going through, trying to focus both our operating and capital resources. Today's presentation is going to be predominantly about service, but I think it's important to realize that there was a lot of effort looking at all of our internal spending, making sure that first and foremost we got our own house in order. And then we also assessed our entire capital program to reallocate several $100 million from our capital program to support our operating budget. And it was only then the third level saying, how do we then think about reducing our service and making sure, like I said, we don't reduce service across the entire system the same level, but trying to make sure that we provided the best service for our most transit critical riders. And then on those non-essential service, provide a reduced level of service that better matches existing ridership. And the intent here is, even though it's a challenging time, that we are trying to forge towards a more equitable and efficient transit system to make sure we can support the Commonwealth as it reopens. Critically, so what I'm going to talk through today, this ENF encompasses all of the service changes that were envisioned in the Forging Ahead program. A small proportion of those went into effect in January, particularly some small ones on the commuter rail and ferry, but the vast majority of them would be going into effect this March and April. And since the board vote in December 14th for these changes, we did receive additional funding from the federal government, which is being used to offset some of the board approved changes. And I will try to call those out while trying to be transparent about what was in the original ENF and then where we are actually going to have some changes versus what we implement in March. And that fundamentally, as we go forward, as these changes, we will constantly be reviewing, and I'll talk about this, how these changes are impacting both crowding and demand. And we do look at our service levels on a quarterly or every 6 months based on the mode, and are going to look at that very, very careful, trying to think how to be both predictive and reactive to ridership coming back. And then also, just to state again, both the bus and commuter rail are already undergoing transformation efforts. And when we think about re-adding service to both those modes, really going to try to do so with those frameworks in mind, thinking about regional rail, thinking about a better bus network that better serves our passengers and customers' needs. So I think this is a really great chart just to highlight sort of what we're looking at as the T right now in terms of rider. Like I said, we went from 1.3 to under 400,000 riders. This is a chart that shows all of our ridership indexed back to the end of February 2020, with each line corresponding to one of our modes. And what this basically shows is that our ridership dropped very precipitously back in March and has slowly been recovering and essentially reaching its high water mark in September, October, before dropping off for the winter, which is very typical and very seasonal, and we see that every year. And throughout the pandemic, we've had 3 modes that have been most durable, which means they've retained the greatest proportion of the riders, and that's the bus system, though we do see significant variation by bus routes. Our paratransit division, which is that dotted black line, and the blue line. And all of them have been tracking as high as 30-35% of pre-COVID ridership, versus our other modes like the ferry and commuter rail are closer to about 10-15% pre-COVID ridership. So again, showing that significant variation and the fact that essentially we've been at the same level of ridership since September and October. Though obviously we do expect that to come back over the next few years. Now, when we thinking about that ridership and thinking about that there's significant variation across the system, what we try to do is say, all right, we need to reduce some service, and we need to think about what's the best way to use our resources. But we want to make sure that no matter what, that we are providing for our essential riders what we call basically our minimum acceptable service level, which is our service delivery policy, which defines what the T says is, hey, this is what we think minimal acceptable service is in terms of hours of operation, how late things operate, how frequently buses and trains come, how many people should be on a vehicle at any time. And we want to say is what we're defining as essential services based on two key factors that no matter what, we want to make sure we're providing that minimum acceptable service level. And so we looked at those two factors, which is one is on the left-hand side, how many riders or the ridership potential, which was a combination of how many riders were on that mode or route pre-COVID and how many riders continue to stay on that route throughout the pandemic, which we found to be a really good indicator of how many of those riders were essentially essential workers. And then also a question of the riders, what proportion of the riders are meeting one or more attributes. So we say, these are essential riders. We want to make sure we're serving them, which was a combination of low-income communities or individuals, households, people of color, low car or zero car households, people with disabilities, and seniors. We take all that combined, that top left box is what we're saying is, hey, we think these are our most transit critical services, which is all of our rapid transit, blue, orange, red, green, and Mattapan. Many of our bus routes, about half of them, so 80 bus routes, and the Fairmont Commuter Rail. And so we're saying these routes are the ones we want to make sure we continue to provide our minimum acceptable service. And the other routes and modes, it's not to say that they're not important and they're not serving key riders, but that we are okay with reducing service on those routes and modes to a better match ridership so that we can make sure that we continue to provide quality service for that top left box. So I'll go through then what that actually means in terms of specific changes by mode, but just want to talk a little more about the process we followed in the fall to get where we are today. So the first is just context of what we did and when it goes into effect. So we first proposed these service changes on November 9th. We held a series of 10 or 11 meetings over November and December. And then we had our board take a contingent vote in mid-December. And that is contingent on both their acceptance of the Title VI analysis and this environmental review. And then implementation start, you can see varied by mode, with some commuter rail changes and ferry changes going into effect in January, but the vast majority of the changes going into effect in April and March. And on the right-hand side, again, a reminder that it's a constantly changing and evolving process as we do update service multiple times throughout a year. So as riders come back and as riders change and travel patterns change, we can try to be as responsive as possible. And then I did briefly want to speak about the public engagement process we went through last fall and winter. So it was 11 meetings, there we go. 10 public meetings and 1 public hearing, about 2,000 attendees across them all, supported in multiple languages. We also, the MBTA piloted a new program by hiring community liaisons to help us target and reach out to a lot more organizations than we're usually able to get out to, which I think was incredibly effective. And then we received nearly 7,000 public comments across all of these forums. And with that, we did, and anyone on this call is welcome also to see that a report of that public engagement process is also available online at mbta.com/forgingahead-comments. And it summarizes both the method and the feedback we heard from this process, which is really important as we think about rebuilding service. And the public outreach was really trying to answer 2 questions. The first question was, did we define essential service rights? based on our analysis and our thinking, this is what we think is most essential. Did we get it right? And hearing the public, and what we heard loud and clear from the public was generally it was better to reduce frequency than give up span and access. And span is how early or how late something operates. And access basically means, are we making sure that people have access to at least one option of MBTA or multiple options of MBTA, that they weren't stranded? And so we took a lot of feedback and we actually changed what we originally proposed. And as I go through, I'll explain what those changes were. And we also heard that when we bring back service, it's probably most important to be prioritizing frequency on bus and rapid transit. And so it's really two questions, like one, what did we get wrong? What should we change? And what we're implementing this spring? And two, when we think about rebuilding service, how should we think about that and what should we prioritize that? So that's will continue to be a really important touchstone for us as we go forward. So that was sort of the process and a high level overview. I know I'm going quite quickly, but I know for some of, I think the people on the call, this is very familiar, but I want to make sure there's a basic understanding all through it. And then again, happy to answer any questions. I'll now talk through each of the changes by mode, and then discuss about how we're going to think about bringing back service. So like I said up front, again, between November and December, we did go through a significant number of changes based on public feedback of, again, highlighting that very important to keep some access and span. And essentially, the public feedback was very helpful at helping us identify behaviors and travel trends of transit critical riders that would lose access and span that we missed in the initial analysis. And some examples of that is we preserved more bus routes that actually would lead to more stranding, which is when you're more than a half mile away from MBTA services. We highlighted that, and we changed the fact that some municipalities were losing all MBTA options. That was changed. It was very loud and clear in the public feedback as well that really critical to keep late night service because there's a lot of second and third shift medical workers who need access, especially across the Boston Harbor. And then we also, through public feedback, were able to identify some additional areas where there are actually a larger number of low to no car households who needed access that perhaps we did not appropriately reflect the first time around. So it was very effective feedback and incorporated into our changes. So now going mode by mode, and all modes look the same way. Trying to, again, at the top is on the left-hand side is sort of first is the ridership we saw on that mode in fall 2020, which again was the high watermark of ridership so far in the pandemic, which for bus was about 41%. We've also been trying to project out what we think ridership may look like along with MassDOT over the next few years based on a number of factors, including the future of work, COVID abatement, and the economic recovery of the region. And so based on that, we think by this summer, we're probably looking at 50–55% of pre-COVID ridership, though again, travel patterns may look very different. And on the right-hand side says of what we're going to run this spring, we originally proposed to run about 85–90% pre-COVID service hours. With the CARES Act 2 funding we've received, that's actually going to be closer to 90%. So even this spring with the changes, we will still be on bus running 90% of pre-COVID service hours. Where those service hours are may be changed so we can better respond to ridership and crowding. So for example, there's more than 20 routes right now where we are running above pre-COVID service levels because there's such durable ridership on that and we need to support the ability for folks to socially distance. But the number is actually 90% right now. Some of the specific changes, just to walk through. So there are no changes to hours of operations for the bus system. So if your route is still operating, it should be starting and ending at the same time. Though some services are being reduced to peak only. We are suspending 20 routes. 11 were already suspended earlier due to COVID response. An additional 9 would go into suspension this spring. Some routes are being consolidated, some are being shortened. And like I said, a few routes would operate only during the peak, really to ensure that we're providing support for schools. We would continue to provide suburban subsidies to all 5 communities. Those were originally proposed to be suspended, but they were restored. And then throughout the routes that are operating, We originally proposed a 20% frequency reduction on non-essential routes. And again, that's system-wide, so any one route might be different, and 5% on essential. That's what we proposed in December. And then again, based on the CARES Act 2 funding, we are restoring some of that service, but the exact amount yet we haven't calculated. It's probably somewhere between a third and a half being restored. So those are the bus changes. And again, many of these are going to affect on March 14th. And then rapid transit would be pre-fall 2020, we had about 24% of pre-COVID ridership. We're expecting somewhere between 28 to 50% of ridership by this summer. And we will still be running, as of this spring, about 80% of pre-COVID service. And again, we've restored about 10% through the public feedback process. We are not making any changes to hours of operations for rapid transit. So transit still operate at midnight, will continue to operate at midnight. Transit operate at 6 a.m., will continue to operate at 6 a.m. There is no changing to our operating footprint, and that specifically at one point we were proposing to stop Green Line service between Brigham Circle and Heath Street. That was eliminated from the proposal, and we will continue to run all Green Line service. The only changes are on the frequency. So on the green, orange, and red line, we'll be running 20% service. That sounds like a lot, but that actually only means that most people will be waiting an additional minute to 3 minutes per train. And we think based on the low ridership, and we're keeping a close eye on this, we don't expect an increase in crowding. And on the blue line, which has been very durable throughout the pandemic, it's a 5% reduction. And that's coming a little bit down in the what used to be traditionally that 9 to 5 peak that we're just not seeing anymore. We're reducing it from there, but we are actually adding more service in the midday where we've seen more ridership. So those are the rapid transit changes. So again, system-wide about a 20% service reduction, but predominantly on the green, orange, and red, which have been much lower ridership than the blue line. On commuter rail, we originally last fall had about 13% pre-COVID ridership. We're thinking in July we'll see somewhere between 15 to 30%. And we originally proposed that we would be running about 70% of service hours. As of yesterday, actually, or was it Monday, which was yesterday, we've just announced our spring service schedules. And based on some really hard work and diligent work by the planning teams, both at Keolis, who is our contractor for the railroad, and Mbta, they've actually been able to develop a schedule that will allow for 80% of all pre-COVID service hours. So it's actually better than was originally estimated. In terms of hours of operation, we had originally proposed to end weekday service at 9 p.m. That's another thing that's changed based on CARES Act 2 and was announced on Monday. We will continue to operate late weekday evening service. I think it's probably slightly different than pre-COVID, maybe ending up to an hour earlier, but the exact schedules should be available online shortly. But we are operating past 9 p.m., which is a difference from what we originally proposed on December 14th. What is in the changes are the suspension of some weekend service. So we would maintain it on the Worcester, Providence, Newbury, Rockport, Middleborough, and Fairmont lines, and we would suspend it on the lower ridership lines, which I can have a list if people want to go through. And then there are 5 very low ridership stations we're proposing to close, all within close proximity of other stations that do have parking. And that throughout the day, we would reduce peak and off-peak frequency. But where we end up right now is actually a much smoother level of service throughout the entire day, which is actually moving us closer to regional rail. So I think it's actually, this is quickly becoming a chance for us to pivot into a much stronger commuter rail system in the future. And then finally, the ferry. The ferry was 12% pre-COVID ridership. We think somewhere between 15 to 30% similar to commuter rail. We originally proposed in November to completely suspend the ferry based on public feedback. We are continuing to run the Hingham and Hull service weekday only, and we suspended the Charlestown line and the Hingham direct service. But both Hingham and Hull have retained their ferry service, and we'll keep a close eye on the ridership going forward. And then the one final piece that I haven't included is the ride. The ride is our paratransit division, and its service is based on changes made to commuter rail and bus. And as the bus and the commuter rail changes go into effect, the ride too would change. But we are very critically, we are not changing the geographical service area of the ride. The major changes are your particular fare may go from 88 to premium based on changes to the bus system, and then also due to the commuter rail hours of operation. And then the last piece I wanted to cover is how we're thinking about restoring service. So and again, based on the public feedback, is most of our fiscal year 21 service changes are essentially now frequency changes, which means we heard a lot like if you're suspending my route or short-turning my route, how will you know when it comes time to add it back? And because of the changes we made between November and December, I think we're in a much stronger place where we can monitor ridership and know if ridership is increasing to the point where additional service is needed. And but us trying to be both predictive and reactive. We're also fiscal year 21 service levels. And the reason you'll generally see that our service hours is essentially at least double the existing ridership is so that we continue to support the need for social distancing. And so once social distancing is no longer required based on public health guidance, we know there's definitely space as well to carry more riders. And then when we think about adding back service, very clear to say that the timing of service restoration will depend on public health guidance and very much looking to the Commonwealth for their guidance here, and the timing of the Commonwealth post-vaccination reopening plan. That being said, in addition to that, in addition to all of our ridership data, we're monitoring very closely through a lot of data sources. So surveying our passengers on a monthly basis, surveying employers, nearly 60 employers who I think cover and represent nearly 60,000 workers, on their plan to return to work and their plan and futures for teleworking, roadway data, travel data that we get from our partners at MassDOT, and economic recovery planning, conversations with school systems, conversations with universities, conversations with hospitals, all to think about how riders may come back, when they might come back, and when they come back, we know, and I think it's fair to say, travel patterns are likely forever changed. And so how does our transit system reflect that? And then we also, throughout the year, will have two major planning programs, bus network redesign and rail transformation, which should give an opportunity, further opportunity for a public impact about what's working and what's not working for individuals and communities, in addition to quarterly service planning changes. And then I think, like I said at the beginning, finally, we got a lot of great input during the initial public engagement process about how to think about prioritizing and bringing back service. And we will continue to use that and refer to that throughout the next year. And then we just kicked off our fiscal year 22 budget planning process, and the fiscal year 22 service levels should start becoming a part of that conversation over the next month. So with that, I thank everyone for listening to me for 25 minutes. I know there's a lot there, but I really appreciate you taking the time. And I'm now going to hand over to Andrew.
Great, Kat, thank you very much. So just real quickly, the MBTA filed this ENF on February 1st. You can see it, that's the mbta.com/forging ahead, and right on that page is the button for the environmental review, and you can click on that. The ENF is actually made up of 5 document pieces. It's the ENF itself, or the form itself, and there's a memo to Mepa that lays out an overview of the program and what we're doing. So it gives us some context and some understanding. We put in the package showing the original proposal that Kat talked about that we did back in December. The third document is based on the public comment that was received. Kat talked about revisions that were made. And so this is the revised proposal based on that public comment. Kat showed you a slide that showed the stakeholder engagement document, the summary of all the stakeholder engagement. That is a document submitted, and that's on the website. And then lastly, there is an air quality analysis. We asked the Commonwealth Central Transportation Planning Staff, which is the transportation modeling agency, among other things for the Commonwealth. They did an analysis showing, based on the services that were changing, what would the air quality analysis be? And so that's a balancing of were any riders to move from lack of transit service over to automobiles, and counterbalanced by the vehicles that the MBTA will not be running and those emissions that the MBTA would not be putting out because of the service we take off the street, the fewer commuter rail trips, buses, things like that. There's also, that same document has an impact to environmental justice communities and lays that out. So that's prepared by CTPS. So those 5 pieces are the heart of the ENF, and they are all sitting on our website. That first URL, that's where we're going to be posting this deck. It'll be up there tomorrow. So if you go to that, mbta.com, forging-ahead, you'll be able to see this deck as the next component of that ENF. And I think with that, we turn it back to Erin. You're on mute.
Yeah, so I guess we can open it up to questions. I had a few questions, so I can start, I guess. So I had a question on the air quality and equity analysis included in the ENF submission. I guess the metric that the MBTA was using is the service hours, and the term that was used in the equity analysis was revenue vehicle hours. And I was just wondering if that's the same thing or not, or that's different.
Yeah, those are the same.
Okay.
A revenue vehicle hours just means it's a service. It's how many hours the vehicles are available for the public to get on them. So those
okay, so those two terms are interchangeable.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And then I was hoping to talk a little bit more about the building back and how the Better Bus Network and the rail vision, how that will inform the way that the service will be added back when it's, appropriate, I guess.
Sure. Was there a specific question or just in general? How will that?
Yeah, just in general.
Kat, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. And then Lindsay, please jump in for anything I've missed. They're very different processes. So let me do bus first and then commuter rail. So for bus we've been probably now it's part of the Better Bus Project, which has been a multi-year effort trying to improve and transform our bus network. One of the last or key components is network redesign, and just give some context here, which is the idea that our bus network today or pre-COVID was largely unchanged to account for changing work patterns and changing housing patterns. So we don't necessarily have routes that serve where people need to go and want to go. So network redesign is a multi-year effort that is looking at essentially all origin and destination data throughout the region and saying, how do we better provide and redesign service to better match the needs of our communities? There is working closely with an external task force that includes many of our municipalities and advocates. And then we were actually planning to kick off a key part of the public engagement session last year, just the start of the pandemic, but that got obviously pushed off a few months. So we're restarting that throughout this year to say and go to the public and say, here's what we're thinking about, here's prioritizing that. And you can imagine if you're a public member, is what you may have seen in other communities and other transit agencies is being to share, like, could you imagine a network map that looks like this, that provides this level of frequency and this level of service? And so I think it's the question is, as we add back service, it's making sure that when we add it back, we're also taking that into account. So both the combination of, I think the ridership and the data should tell us essentially when we need to add back, and the network redesign will help us tell about how we need to add back. And so an example of that, two potential examples of that are purely illustrative is, one is maybe we had a bus route that was suspended or changed or short-turned, which means it only goes half the way and then heads back the other direction. And network redesign is helping identify, currently the bus route is going from A to B. But when we actually look at the riders in that area, they're all going A to B to C. What if we brought back that bus route so it actually just goes straight to A to C, because that's where it looks like people really want to go. So maybe that's a change that we would implement as part of adding back. The other one potentially is thinking about, and the other key element is thinking through where we need to provide higher frequency service or more direct service. A great example is between in Chelsea and East Boston and Everett. We have a bus route that operates that, the 112, which is currently works really well as a what we call our coverage route or a local route, because it provides everyone a chance to get on the bus, but it runs at a much lower frequency. And the question is, there's a lot of potential demand there. Should we also create a bus route that's just running between two essential destinations to provide a very high frequency service? And not to say that we would do any of this, but this is essentially the process by which saying when we add back service, do we add back in the exact same locations, in the exact same frequency, in the exact same routes, or does it bring back network, go through the network redesign process, which will have a very robust public process. I don't want anyone who's listening to think we haven't, that we're going to jump straight to this with the network. Like the whole next year should be that public process. Is thinking that it may change how we bring it back. And on the commuter rail side, I think the April schedules actually speak to that and trying to move to a regional system where it's much more like a, it's not as much peak oriented, so 9 to 5, but the fact that it's running regularly, it's something very reliable, it's running on clock face schedules. And our commuter rail schedules right now are testing and thinking about how do we attract riders using that system. And I'll hand it over to Lindsay. That's a very long answer, Erin. I hope that answers it. But Lindsay, anything you would add?
I just think it's important to reiterate that on a quarterly basis, and in some cases on a biannual basis, we look at our ridership data. I mean, so it's a weekly email that Kat and I get saying what's happening on this mode, what's happening on that mode, and then there are tweaks that we can make and that we continue to make it to address issues. Crowding is sort of at the forefront of our mind right now. But as we look at some of these larger decisions about what needs to change, you can envision it basically in every season. We are engaging in a process, and by and large a public process with our board saying what is service going to look like and what are we doing. And so I think the public has, I hope, lots of opportunities to feel like they know what's going on and can engage with us in addition to the various websites that are available, but the public events that we hold on an ongoing basis, which are sort of the baseline to additionally what Kat is talking about for some of these bigger, more substantive changes in our system. I think hearing from our riders is essential. And so data tells us one thing, but we hope the riders will continue to tell us the other qualitative experiences they are having that maybe we're not seeing in the numbers.
Thank you, Lindsay. I think Anthony, actually, do you want to add something too?
Thanks, Kat. You just brought it up, and there was a question that I saw in the chat that alluded to this, so I wanted to hop in here. Andrew from LRTA asked, how frequently can schedules be restored by mode? I recall that commuter rail schedules can only be changed twice per year.
Yep, and so yeah, so our ferry and commuter rail schedules essentially change twice a year, and our bus and rapid transit changes 4 times a year, though there is some limited flexibility to change more frequently, depending on the situation.
I see another question, Anthony, in the chat, which asked to describe the air quality impacts noted in the report, both pre and post changes. And so if people will bear with me for not looking at you, I'm looking now at the report itself so I can get it right. And Andrew, jump in if I get any of this wrong. Essentially at the high level, what we're doing is saying, given the service changes, how do you balance that some people may shift to auto diversion and start to drive cars, which we know add pollutants to the air. But at the same time, when the MBTA reduces service, we also are removing pollutants from the air because our MBTA service system certainly is a contributor of pollutants. So what we look at, what we did then is looking at each vehicle type. Again, you can find this online for those who are really excited and want to get into the nitty gritty. I'm on page 7 of that report. If you have any difficulty finding it, we can certainly repost it. But that we're looking at comparing passenger vehicles to bus, and we have 4 different types of buses that we run. And for each one of those, we're looking at various types of particulate matter, NO2, CO2, CO, and then at the commuter rail level. And for commuter rail, again, we run a couple different kinds of locomotives, and finally ferry. And each of those produce pollutants. At the end of the day, then you're comparing. And we share in the report what the source of pollutants is by each one of those engines. finally, we take all of those different emission types and compare to our spring 2020, what essentially our board, what we were running in spring 2020 to what our board voted on, which would be our new level of service in the summer of 2021. Now, Kat has already said, we're trying to make some shifts and not put all of those service changes into effect, but we did run the analysis sort of with assuming all of those changes went into effect. So hopefully we are preserving as much service as we possibly can. But the takeaway is that air quality does increase for Massachusetts by and large by the MBTA running less service. Now we can all talk about which one of those we want to pay attention to, but we saw the greatest level of reduction for nitrous oxide and then in particulate matter with much lower reductions in CO. I hope that's helpful to the question that somebody posted in the chat. Anthony, did you want to go to some of the raised hands? Would that make sense?
Before I do that, I just wanted to make sure that Erin didn't have any additional questions.
I do have some additional questions, but well, I guess, so I will ask this one additional question now while we're on the subject of the equity analysis. So I'm looking at table 8, and I was wondering in the equity analysis, it's the summary of route eliminations by weekly route miles. And so one of the modes, bus, it describes the minority share of net change as 52%. And, under total, it drops down to 30%. But I guess I was wondering how how that number 52% is considered, not disparate, because I guess, 52% of the minority the minority population is experiencing 52% of that change. So I was wondering how, that's considered not disparate, I guess. I don't know. It's a little detail oriented.
No,
but
it's okay. It's okay. Let me see if I can catch up to the table that you are looking at. Would it be all right if we maybe jump to one next caller and then I can come back? Because I'm going to look at those numbers and try to give you a better response than if I just winged it.
Sure. Yeah. 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 So we can go through. Anthony, I don't know if you want to go through the comments in the chat. Yes.
Sure. I think actually the next person in the queue is Andy from Cambridge. Andy, you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Great. So as the City of Cambridge staff, I'm a transit planner in the Community Development Department. We actually have a good amount of experience in looking at ENFs, and essentially the question that I'm understanding that we have to answer is whether we feel like the environmental impacts have been sufficiently disclosed or studied. And I think Erin said that at the beginning. So one of the questions that we are curious to hear the MBTA is thinking about is actually related to the air quality analysis. And so we were trying to get an understanding of why it only looks at June or July 2021, given that the air quality impacts and the potential for mode shift away from transit is a very significant question that comes up with the service changes that the MBTA has proposed. So 2021, June or July is only 3 or 4 months away, and we all clearly still expect to be in this kind of pandemic mode in some form. Our worry is that the service cuts, the way that they're being handled now, are going to result in people who have options and not necessarily the transit dependent choosing to not come back to transit. We feel, that that's a reasonable expectation given the level of service provided potentially, depending on how service comes back. So could you speak a little bit to why the cutoff is in 2021 rather than looking forward either toward the end of this year in 2021 or future summers? We weren't sure exactly how the analysis landed on this date.
Sure. Lindsay, you want me to do that?
Sure. Go ahead, Andrew.
So the way that we had CTPS do the analysis, the way we view the ENF in total is we are analyzing a large packet of service changes. And we know two things. We know they won't happen. They probably won't all happen. Some of them will change. We'll figure out different ways to do it. Things could change, but they also are not happening all at the same time. They are happening in iteration that Kat talked about. For the purpose of the analysis, however, we did assume that when they are all in place, and so we just picked, let's assume that they're all in place for the summer, for July, and all those service changes were in place. What would be the change in air quality from that point in time? It could be July, it could be anything from that point in time to compare back to pre-COVID days. So I don't think there's anything magical about the July. It's just the point in time which we, for academic purposes, say that all of the changes were in place. So it could be July. It's actually probably something like further out. But the worst case scenario to us is if all of these service changes went into place right away. That would be the greatest impact, the greatest period, the most critical period of time. So we looked at it that way. It is somewhat hypothetical because, or imagine it, because we know that it's not happening all at one time, but it would create the greatest environmental impact. So that's what we studied. The analysis then also does look at those riders that would shift to, it analyzes some riders when they don't have the transit access will go to a non-motorized, they'll start walking or biking or doing something. Some will just not take the trip, and it'll be a trip that just gets dropped, and some will move to an automobile. And so it also analyzes the environmental impacts of those people who move into an automobile and the emissions that come from that. And the environmental air quality numbers that Lindsay was talking about are a net of those two things. Okay. Hope that helps.
Thanks, Andrew. Next, we're going to go to.
Can I add one thing to that, Anthony? I think we are required and happy to submit an ENF when we make a 10% service reduction, and that was a decision that our board made in December of 2020. I think to the caller's question, predicting the future beyond the next 6 months was too far for our board to know, to even think about service. So we were sort of stuck in, this is what we think the summer will look like, and that's what we could base an analysis on. But I do appreciate the long-term implications of changing transit are really important. It's not to say that we don't ever want to look at these issues again, or that this is done, but what we were triggered to do was sort of what was in front of us. And frankly, we had to analyze something to understand sort of a pre and post. What would the world be looking like next? Sorry, Anthony.
No worries. Kat, did you want to hop in?
Nope.
Nope. Okay. Next, we'll go to Caitlyn Allen Connolly. Caitlyn, do you want to unmute and ask your question or make your comment?
Sure. Thank you, Anthony. And thank you guys for this presentation. This is helpful. At the beginning, I was slightly afraid it wasn't going to address the ENF, but it sounds like it's going in that direction. I have a couple of questions. I'll just speak them out and then you guys can take them as you see fit. So one of the questions I have around the ENF, just in terms of the approach and methodology, is related to the information about ridership characteristics. At Monday's FMCB meeting, people on your team provided updated information on the ridership and the Mbta, including ridership characteristics. Could you explain why the ENF uses the 2015-17 data from the system-wide survey for the ENF as opposed to the current information that you guys are collecting around low-income and minority riders? I guess another question I have in terms of approach is, could you speak to why the ENF does not provide detailed information on the impact by mode and service reductions and sort of eliminations, which is linked to more of a question of the cuts are being made or claimed to be made system-wide, but in fact, some of the cuts are actually very specific to certain lines that are impacting certain populations. And also to speak to what the previous person just asked, the ENF does not speak to any potential long-term impacts associated with the mode shift that could potentially happen if the Mbta is not able to increase service safely to accommodate any incremental change in service to support a return to the workplace. Specifically on the commuter rail, if scheduling is done twice a year, how will the MBTA be able to respond quickly to any increase in demand to prevent people from mode shift? And similar to Erin, I had a question around tables 5 through 8. If you could, or at a different time, someone could sort of help me walk through that. I also had a question related to the totals, and also specifically in many of these calculations, if the data being used around low income and minority is from 2015, 2017, it doesn't reflect the current ridership patterns. It might not necessarily be reflecting the full impact. And then lastly, and thank you for your patience, could you speak to us about the cost savings, any workforce implications in the timeline and cost for restoration? The information that wasn't actually noted in the slides, but was provided with the ENF, actually provided cost savings information for the original set of Forging Ahead service reductions and cuts. So I'm just wondering about that. Thank you.
Okay. How do we start? There's a lot of questions in there.
There were a few. Can I start with the rider demographics, Andrew, which I think is where we began. So I think what is important to understand is the rider demographics that were shared at our board meeting this Monday come from a fundamentally different data set, which is obviously what you picked up on. One was 2017, one is much more recent rider surveys. Our 2017 comprehensive rider survey is what we are required to use for the Federal Transit Administration as we do service equity analyses and fare equity analyses, and is sort of it is our baseline. We actually were planning to redo that full rider survey in 2021, and now because of COVID, we're kind of pushed off. So we're using our 2017 comprehensive data set. In part because we want to know more and talk to our riders more than every 5 years. The MBTA has launched a customer panel, which is where we push out questions to frequent riders, and then we try to weight those riders by mode based on what mode they use to understand some of their demographics and some of the use. But you would notice on those slides that sometimes our N, or our total response rate, is significantly smaller than you would have in our overall rider survey. And so it is a chance for us to take a snapshot, but I would say not as comprehensive, which is why the 2017 data we still feel like is the most comprehensive set of understanding sort of who our riders were before the pandemic. I would completely agree with you that our demographics are changing, but I think they are in the middle of that change, and we don't have a solid data set to draw on as of yet to really understand. And they're changing, week by week at this point in time. So it is on our agenda as soon as it is safe to begin a more comprehensive rider survey and get updated demographics to reflect what we believe are some changes as we're seeing in our more informal customer opinion panel. Ms. Allen Conley, you had a few questions there and I tried to grab them all, and I don't think I did a good job. But one of the questions you were asking was, I think, about commuter rail and the impacts that commuter rail will have in a longer term way. We are expecting, as is the rest of the world, that commuting patterns are changing. Telework seems to be on the rise, but we don't know to what extent. The commuter rail schedules that were released earlier this week look at us moving towards something closer to a regional rail with regular service. I live out on the Worcester line, where approximately every hour there will be a train into Boston, and approximately every hour there will be a train back out. Historically, that was not possible. Our system was designed that you could take a train in the morning, and if you had only a 2-hour meeting, you were probably going to be stuck in Boston for many more hours. And many people, therefore, would not take commuter rail for those sort of shorter trips. Our hope by resetting the service to something more reflective of a regional rail model allows us to build in more frequency then at our greater intervals. If it was every hour, maybe in the future we look at every 45 minutes or every half hour for some of our lines, and that thus commuter rail stays an attractive alternative. Right now our concern is that it is not attractive, even though for some of the people that are returning to Boston. I'm not sure that answered your question, but that's sort of where we're going. I think what we don't know is how will that change riding patterns? And so as you're asking for us to sort of project forward beyond the summer of 2021, is that going to be responsive? What we're learning through our Rail Vision process is that's the kind of model people want us to move towards. It's one step. They want us to do many more things too, but that was an important step. And so I think we'll be analyzing to see what ridership patterns look like to then understand the ultimate impacts on the environment, on, you know, people moving out of cars and hopefully into commuter rail. So we're trying to make that a more attractive service for our riders.
And Lindsay, if I could just add on there too, because I think on an explicit question about the ability to respond, I think it's really helpful just to remember the numbers too of like, we currently have less than 15% of pre-COVID ridership, and we will be running 80% of service. So I think we have a lot of room to grow. And from our scenario planning, and this is largely consistent with what we're seeing at other transit agencies and from Mbta as well, of commuter rail likely to come back the slowest. And so I think 6 months, that is our hunch and our hypothesis is that will be enough time to see ridership returning, durable revenue returning, and respond. But that being said too, is if we do see some really spot crowding or issues, there are other options that exist to some degree, right? Adding some trains, making trains longer, and in situations too, potentially adding a few trains outside of the schedule. So there are some options if we're in a real crowding situation. But I think again, we have less than 15% of ridership, more than 80% of service balanced throughout the day. I think that is, something that we think we will be able to handle in the immediate and near-term future.
Thanks, Kat and Lindsay. Next, I want to turn it over to Colin Codner from the Greater Lynn Chamber of Commerce. Colin?
Hi, guys. Colin Codner. Thank you so much for being here. I wanted to talk briefly about the social equity corridor. It's the track between Lynn and Boston. Pre-COVID, a pilot program was launched to provide increased frequency and reduced fare along this line, really to grow ridership and see which, to identify riders who wanted to utilize the commuter rail, but were not able to because the trains were infrequent or routinely full. So I'm just curious on how the T is proposing to kind of roll back into some of these pilot initiatives to figure out how that social equity corridor is really going to be serviced with the commuter rail or other systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have tried to use frankly, the terrible state of the pandemic to try to see if we can innovate, even though we have a big, robust, and sometimes clanky system. And one of those ways to do that is through fare pilots. We have 2 different ones going on right now, trying to induce some mode shift and trying to really to hopefully alleviate. Both were about alleviating crowding and making for a better experience. One is in Lynn, and that pilot is designed to allow people to, using a zone 1A fare, be able to, instead of taking one of the buses that had experienced more crowding, that they could take the commuter rail at a pretty significantly reduced cost and get into the city that way. Our second one is a pilot with Brockton Area Transit, so our RTA partner out of Brockton, that runs buses from Brockton to Ashmont, so connects up to the Red Line. And that buses were also crowded, and that reached out and said, is there something we can do to help? And so we are also offering zone 1A fares right now as a COVID mitigation strategy to allow anyone from the 3 Brockton stations to go right into South Station on a zone 1A fare. We are actively analyzing all of those pilots. The Brockton pilot, people enrolled, we're surveying them to understand how their ridership patterns are changing. The Lynn pilot is, we've had people out surveying and trying to understand, is this sufficient enough? And while I appreciate the question, we also know mode shift is tricky. If you've read our, if you've really gotten into it with us and read our commuter rail zone study, you will know that fares are one of the reasons that people will shift mode, but it is not in and of itself sufficient. And so we're kind of using this opportunity to look and see, well, with a pretty drastic drop in the fare and the induced potential getting away from crowded buses, is that a good enough reason? And if not, why not? And so I think I'm not at a place to say for sure what will be next for those, because they are still both in pilot phase. Brockton is currently scheduled to end, I believe, May 30th, so that's online, so please double check that. And I'm pretty sure the Lynn is scheduled for June 30th. And so we will be over the next couple of months trying to analyze and figure out if they are meeting their goals, and if not, why not? And if yes, then what do we do next with those?
No, thank you so much. Would there be any interest in extending that pilot as well? Or is it kind of June 30th?
I think that one we're gonna have. I'm gonna have to say I have to wait and see. Where looking at ridership is going to be really important, and our the survey data that our Office of Performance Management and Innovation are just wrapping up to figure out is it inducing significant enough mode shift to justify the subsidy, right? And is it having any impact on public health, right? That's the fundamental goal for this one.
Yeah.
So we're still very much looking at it. That pilot has been extended a couple of times if you've been watching, and so
yeah,
it's on our radar.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Lindsay. Next, there was a question in the chat. With the projected revenue shortfall before the pandemic, coupled with the revenue drop as a result of the pandemic, how will this affect current and future capital projects like South Coast Rail Phase 1 and Phase 2?
So I can take that. That's unless Andrew and Lindsay want to jump in. It's a great question, and I answer in two-part. As part of the Forging Ahead process, I think I mentioned at the top, we looked at all of our capital projects, and we paused a number of them so that we could use the funds to support the operating budget. We have the ability with a number of federal funds that are eligible to be used for our maintenance funds in order to flex them over. Critically though, we did not pause any projects that were actively under construction, which I believe did include South Coast Rail Phase 1. However, we did the entire pause, and anything wasn't canceled. We weren't reprogramming anything, so that we are now in the midst, and I believe it actually kicked off on Monday, is our annual capital investment program plan. And so we are now in the annual process along with MassDOT, trying to reprioritize and figure out what are our capital program priorities for the next year. And so that process should be kicking off, which has a public component as well, over the next few months. And I think the final plan should come in May. So we wanted to make sure while forging ahead, we didn't want to run essentially 2 capital, we call them CIP plans a year. So essentially it was a pause and say, you know what, we can flex this amount over for now, and let's review everything as part of the public process this spring. So that's what we just started on Monday, and that's with both MassDOT and Mbta. But again, anything that was actively under construction was not paused. So GLX, South Coast Rail Phase 1, the Beeline stop consolidation, all that is continuing to go.
Thank you, Kat. The next question was also from the chat. When calculating air quality improvements by reducing the Mbta schedule, are you only counting the decrease in pollutants from Mbta vehicles, or are you netting the pollution from personal vehicles?
So it nets it out. It takes the emissions that are not going to be emitted by the MBTA, counterbalanced by the emissions of the automobiles that go onto the street. Table 2 shows how the net works. So table 2 of the CTPS analysis shows the MBTA minus the automobile for the net change, both in terms of volume and percentage.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Next, we'll go to a raised hand from Alex Train from the City of Chelsea.
Great, thanks everybody. My name is Alex Train. I'm the Director of Housing and Economic Development of the City of Chelsea. I had 2 quick questions and then a general public comment. The first question pertains just to the methodology for the air quality and EJ assessment that was performed as part of the ENF. And I think you may have answered this, but just so I understand it clearly. So the methodology sought to understand the environmental impact at the aggregate level across the service area, as opposed to the more granular level, such as by route or by municipality?
Yes, correct. Across the region, across the MBTA service district, yes.
Okay, and then my second question is whether there were any public health indicators considered as part of that, or if it was strictly focused on air quality.
It was strictly focused on air quality because the increase in VMT is relatively small and the far outweighed by the decrease in transit emissions. So it was pretty much a net positive. So we didn't then tie it back to health impacts.
Okay, great, thank you. And then so my general public comment pertains to, I guess, both the methodology, but also the proposed service cuts for the Route 112 in Chelsea. And I won't take up too much time, but as you all know, Chelsea has been disparately impacted by the pandemic. We've had the highest COVID infection rate, compounding decades of environmental pollution and negative public health outcomes that our residents have suffered through. The proposed methodology that has been used as part of this ENF in our eyes is extremely short-sighted and doesn't factor in the true impacts of the proposed service cuts on the health, economic well-being, and general quality of life of our residents and residents across the Commonwealth. We in Chelsea rely on the 112 bus route to connect the Soldiers Home, which is the Boston area's only publicly owned and operated housing and hospital facility for veterans, primarily elderly and disabled veterans, and our Admirals Hill area, which encompasses a large concentration of our senior population, as well as disabled residents. These are highly valued communities in Chelsea, and depriving them of the ability to run errands, go to the grocery store, or go see a doctor is simply repulsive to us. The city of Chelsea will do everything that we politically can to oppose this service cut and ensure that it is not instated. We seriously hope that the MBTA will consider the cuts that are proposed today and revisiting any cuts to lines in the city of Chelsea. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. I just wanted to remind folks that with public comments, if you want to participate formally in the MEPA process, need to be submitted written in written format. So I appreciate your comment now, but also encourage you to submit written comments to the MEPA office as part of this process as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Aaron. Next question was in the chat. I am still unclear on the standards for restoring service. The only MBTA bus route that serves Billerica, the Route 354, was suspended very early, and our weekend commuter rail service is gone, even though there is no practical alternative.
So I can take it past this, and Lindsay, need to lean on you in a second. And I'm going to have to pull up some stuff on this too to reference. So I will make one statement, then give me 2 seconds to look some stuff up and get back to you on specifically in Billerica. So it was a variety, I think fundamentally starting with, again, the question of transit criticality and saying, we wanted to find what is our essential service first. And we want to make sure we're providing at least the service delivery policy for those essential service. And that essential service, again, was a combination of higher ridership and durable ridership. So more probable to be essential workers, and a combination of looking at riders who are from communities of people of color, low income, low car households or zero car households, people with disabilities, and seniors. And it's in all the other routes we're trying to say that we would be okay with specific frequency reductions in order to ensure that we could still provide essential service. There were some routes that we suspended and there are some routes that we combined. And the intention was there were some individuals who were stranded, which means there are more than a half-mile away for public transit. But overall in the system, I believe it is less than 1% of pre-COVID riders. It's a less than 1,500 people system-wide, though we do recognize there's still a human impact on that. When we think about restoring service, specifically thinking through that, that's actually something we're beginning to specifically talk through right now, and think through when we restore, what are the priorities to restore. And so from the public comment that we heard in the fall, again, what we heard loudest and clearest is access and span is critical because people wanted some access, even if it wasn't the same pre-COVID access. And then thinking about adding frequency, but we're also thinking about as riders come back, where will they come back, and making sure we don't increase crowding either. So I don't have exact answers yet, but I think fundamentally when we think about service, particularly bus service, I think it's really going to come down to, and this is a bit hypothesizing, thinking about the trade-offs between access and frequency, and trying to be both predictive and reactive to where our riders are. Lindsay, anything you want to add up there?
I think you got it, Kat, and I appreciate the anxiety that reducing service causes for folks, but it is without a doubt for us an iterative process, and something that we will be continually reevaluating and looking at and trying to see if the data supports that we need to be providing more service to certain areas, given all of the parameters that Kat laid out in terms of prioritizing our essential service riders.
Thanks, Kat, and thanks, Lindsay. The next question is from the chat. Just a reminder to folks that if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, you can use the raise hand feature. You can find that either under the reactions tab or the participants tab at the bottom of your screen. And you can also submit questions or comments in the chat pod to be read aloud. So the next question asks, I think someone else had already asked about cost savings, but is there any updated information available on the cost savings resulting from the Forging Ahead service cuts?
At this point in time, we are continuing to analyze as we make pivots and turns. You heard we changed our planning with CARES 2 funding. We're not in a place this evening to be able to say exactly, and we're going back to our board on March 8th and expect a continuing conversation about exactly what service changes we're going to be putting into effect. I'm not in a place where I can tell you exactly what the cost savings will be in this fiscal year. Kat, you found your data.
Yeah, no, this was like the 354 segment. So the 354 has not been suspended. It's been consolidated with the 352. And I don't know off the top of my head, I think 1 or 2 stops may not be served right now, but the 354 is still running. It just has been consolidated with the 352. And that's what we did with a number of routes here, for example, like the 62 and 76. And again, there might be a couple blocks and stretches that don't have service, but I'm happy to follow up offline too, and I can make sure you get my contact information if you have any questions specifically about the 354, but the route is not being suspended. It is potentially a longer ride, but it's still running. Sorry, I just wanted to go back and clarify that, but happy to, send you my contact information if you have any questions. And on the yes to your, yeah.
Yes.
And Aaron, I do just want to acknowledge early on, you asked some questions about the equity analysis. I tried to pull it up and understand and remind myself about those. I'm going to have to follow up with you after this meeting because I also recognize that we are also in the middle of doing a more complete Title VI equity analysis. So I hope that is acceptable.
Aaron, you're muted.
Thanks. Sorry. So a follow-up question while we're on that, and I think someone else actually asked this as well. So the equity analysis is based on the 2015, 2017 ridership data, and it wasn't adjusted at all for COVID, or it was in some way?
No, it was not. No,
it wasn't.
So no, FTA requires us every 5 years to do a rider survey. Our last one was done in 2017, and so that is our baseline. There are times when we consider using census data or some other things, but frankly, our rider survey is still better data for us than census tract data. And even though we know it has changed, does it need to be updated? Absolutely. Do we want to do that in the middle of a pandemic as rider patterns are changing so dramatically? No. So we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, and have already started conversations with our partners at FTA about what's the best course of action, about when, for every transit agency across America that was scheduled to do one of these in 2020 or 2021, when do you do them?
Yeah.
is the question. So I don't have an answer for you about exactly when we will do it. I think we're going to keep what we've agreed with FTA is we want to keep sort of our eye on it. And when we think we're at something like a level stasis, and I don't know when that will be, that would be the time to conduct a new, they are a very robust process to do a full rider survey across our entire network, making sure we get, you know, demographic representation at every stop. So they are not small undertakings.
Yeah, understood.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay. We do have another raised hand from Susan Barrett. Susan, do you want to unmute and ask your question or comment?
Hi, I was wondering about fall, when you're going to make the changes to the fall service schedules. And I know you talked about you're in touch with all these different employers and schools, and I'm particularly curious with all the universities, and I know the MBTA has a contract or an agreement with Boston Public Schools. And how are you going to make those decisions? And also, what is your time frame for that? Because staff and even families have to start figuring out those schedules really soon. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Susan. I can take that, and always a pleasure to hear your voice. Great question. So I think it's going to be a multi-phase process. So we are currently, working back. So folks may not realize this, but it typically takes about 2 months prior to a new schedule going into place for us to go through all the work to allow our workforce to pick and select their work. Like most transit agencies and airlines, every rating people select their work, and then getting all the planning and scheduling that goes into it. So for the fall service schedules, which I think will go into effect late August, early September, we essentially probably need to finalize those by the end of May, early June. So there's definitely a lead time there. And we are just now kicking off the fiscal year 22 budgeting process. And so I vision over the next 1 to 2 to 3 months, us going through the public conversation via the board of what's our framework for thinking about how we restore, what are we prioritizing? And I think with that, I think the beginning framework is, so what are we confident in about schools? What are we not confident in? And I think to a degree as well, talking to our public school systems as much as possible, understanding what they're planning for, but I think they're dealing with just as much uncertainty. So I think there's a world where we're gonna try to strike that right balance of what we think is going to happen and how to be as responsive to that as possible. And then I think it's for the employer survey too. I think what we're generally seeing is that employers now, what we've generally heard from our employers is they likely won't, and again, this is broad system-wide, right? They likely won't have their employees coming back until at least the fall. And when they do come back, we think it's going to be not 5 days a week, but there'll still be some teleworking in there too. And so trying to take that all into account and put that out there is, here's what we're thinking and here's what's probable. And I think the other thing that we found very effective through the past year is we've essentially always been keeping a reserve of buses or trains available to essentially respond to crowding where we're seeing it. It was super helpful back March and April when we reduced service due to lower workforce availability, that we could essentially be responding real time, day to day, about where there's crowding and ridership. So long-winded answer to say, I think over the next few months, I think we will be publicly talking about how do we think about re-adding service with the board, and then we will we'll probably make those final decisions in May, and then do the sort of the final communication probably in July and August. I hope that answers your question, Susan. And then again, if you have more questions, you always know how to contact Melissa or me.
Thanks, Kat. It looks like Caitlyn has another comment. Caitlyn, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Sure, thank you so much. The one question two questions is, how can I follow up? Because I do have some technical questions just to better understand the proposal, and I don't want to take up people's time here. And then just related to what she was saying, and now I've like completely lost my train of thought, so I can't remember. So I'll have to like come back to you. It was related to what she was saying, but I can't remember it now. So oh well, lucky you.
Caitlyn, we put in the chat just a few questions, but maybe you can post it again, Anthony. If you have any specific questions, you can reach out to publicengagement@mbta.com. Those of us on this call will be monitoring that, and we'll certainly try to get responses as best as we can to you. If your comment was about what Kat was just talking about, which is about schools and reopening, I think we've already begun conversations with Boston Public Schools, right? We're trying to understand what they're doing. They're trying to understand what we are doing. So, you know, we recognize we have a symbiotic relationship with many of our educational institutions. The colleges are no different, right? And so understanding what they are doing certainly helps us, and trying to figure all that out as close to May for the commenter before. We hope that the summertime gives enough lead time for families to understand what their plans then are of the fall.
Thank you. Actually, my question was just more related to capacity. And thank you, Kat, for answering that question earlier, just around the 80% of the commuter rail, which is actually very helpful. So thank you. I've noted that down. So as we move forward and we expect to see incremental demand for public transit, like you said, probably starting in the fall, will the MBTA be able to provide information on what that looks like in terms of physical distancing and the amount of service that we need to provide? Because obviously, I imagine that as we start to welcome people back to the workplace, that there will be a need for providing fuller service to allow for additional space. So is there an analysis of sort of what that looks like when it's 10% of the workforce, 15, 25, you know, what that looks like, and how you'll be able to accommodate that?
Yeah, so Caitlyn, that is a great question. And I'll say we'll answer two ways. So one is in terms of, and this is both, I think, a very helpful statistic, but it's also a very misleading statistic. So let me explain where it's helpful. So commuter rail here, top left, you see the ridership, what we think ridership might be this summer, and then the service hours. And like I said, commuter rail says 70%, but I think it's actually 80%. To your question, bus is 40%, and we're probably operating around 90%. It isn't as simple as what we think we can support, because it also really matters on time of day. So there is a world where we could imagine 100% of our riders, pretend, let's say 20% of our riders come back. But if they're coming in the midst of day, or they're coming in the parts of the day that isn't necessarily that peak, then there's tons of capacity, right? Typically, our service has been very, very peak oriented. And I think the real question is riders come back, not only when they come back, where they come back, what trips they're making, and also what time of day they're coming back. And so one conversation we're really thinking hard about is, and this is a conversation as old as transit, right, is how do we work collaboratively with our employers to encourage more staggered shifts. And that's a question with teleworking. What we don't know, and I think we're all trying to figure out, is telework employers too, is do you get into this world more where people pop in, as Lindsay said, for that meeting in the afternoon, and they just come in, they're now taking a trip at 12 and 3, or is only 80% of our workforce now coming in, but it's 4 days a week rather than 5 days a week. And so I don't think it's as simple, unfortunately, as saying if X comes back, because there's so many other factors that are so important. Or if it's everyone comes back, but we're now dispersed over all the routes because people are taking a lot more local trips to their grocery store, to their local park, versus everyone trying to get downtown at 9 in the morning. So that's why I think the network redesign process is so interesting and so important, is because as we build back a system, recognizing we have a symbiotic relationship as well, is making sure that we are still an attractive option for folks, so they want to come back to transit, those who aren't riding, or for those who've depended on us all along, that we continue to be there for them. But that realizing we want to support those changing travel patterns, and as we build back, it will look different. And I think that's part of the question we're trying to answer at the same time. So I think it's a great question, Caitlyn. And that's why I say like these stats I think are super helpful as like a quick rule of thumb of like how much are we doing compared to capacity, but realizing that the time of day people are traveling, where they're traveling, also completely is what lies beneath these numbers and why we can't just go off these numbers. And there's a lot of analysis underneath to say, what do we want to predict?
Thank you. And I appreciate that. I understand. And thank you for all the hard work you guys are doing.
Yep. Thank you for your questions and support.
Thanks, Kat. It looks like Andy from the city of Cambridge has raised his hand. Andy?
Yep. So the other question that I had is actually kind of related to this question about, how to add back service. And I think one of the most traumatic things that we hear from the public is the loss of a route or the suspension of a route. And I think, so I definitely hear in the previous response, like thinking about adding back service at the right times of day, but that's in the case that the route exists after March. And so I think what a lot of the public have been communicating to me has been, it seems very opaque about exactly what is the threshold that you all will be using to evaluate that. And I think I heard you start to talk about it a little bit, but I just wanted to see if you could dive into it because we do have several routes in Cambridge that are going to be suspended, that were suspended in December already, or are planned to be suspended in March. And to be able to answer some of the questions, I just want to get a chance to ask, what exactly from the MBTA's perspective are the factors, and what is the threshold that you're looking for some of these changes for those routes to come back?
Andy, great question. I think we covered on this briefly on the process for adding back. I realize we haven't yet communicated any clear thresholds because I think we've been working really hard just to get this ready to implement and make sure it's communicated and discussed. And now we're working the process of how do we think about adding back and restoring. But what we're working on right now is the key data to watch and look at. And that's where recognizing that it isn't just the ridership data, but we're also looking really closely at the roadway data, at streetlight data, of just general movement and transportation along these origins and destinations. And then recognizing too, and I think we hear a lot of this from our more commuter-oriented communities as well, where they've also had routes that are suspended, but knowing that essentially we have routes, specific bus routes that are bellwethers for each other. If we see more riders, let's say on the 501 and 503, which serve from Newton to downtown, that is an indicator. And depending on the boarding and the lighting behaviors, that could be indicative of our commuters coming back, our more, let's say our 9 to 5, more white collar commuters, which implies like, what about the route 505, which is currently suspended? And for the Cambridge routes, I think there's we can look at a lot of the bus routes that are there as well, and the rapid transit. And then I really do think the street light and other sort of all the data we get from MassDOT on their VMT to get a sense too of just general travel patterns, which has been a key leading indicator for us too. Lindsay, I don't know if there's anything else, or Anthony, you wanted to add there.
No, I can certainly appreciate the desire for us to say this is the threshold, and I hope that Kat has explained some level of complexity about a threshold that crowding on one bus on one day in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean we're going to change the plan for the next 3 months. Crowding on a bus over multiple days at different times of day, like, okay, now we've got a confluence of like, we have to do something there, but it's the same thing for building back, right? Crowding is obviously a public health view of this. The flip side here is getting people access to places that they want to go. And so as Kat's trying to, or at least we're trying to explain, we're trying to look at lots of different data that tells us how people are trying to get where they need to go. And right now, our sense is, if people aren't using our system, many of them aren't using other systems. And so they're not yet going. Once they start going, then we got to figure out where they're going and which parts of our system could be, are the ones that we either need to turn back on or ramp up service in terms of frequency.
No, I think that's succinct. I think we just haven't heard it, in such a clear way before. And clearly, I think, Kat, you mentioned you've been trying to implement it. And just to also throw out a wild idea out there, is there any possibility that the MBTA would update bus schedules in particular more often than 4 times a year?
I will say that I think in the current way so as a wild idea, Andy, I love it. I am all for us continue to discuss about it. I will say it is a monumental organizational effort to change schedules, even on a quarterly basis. You can imagine the service planning, the scheduling. We then have to spend 6 weeks selecting the work for our operators. And then obviously we integrate with our statewide payroll systems and then getting the paper schedules out there, et cetera. And that's not to say we wouldn't want to do that someday potentially, but I think it's a question of from the setting of even before we put the new schedule out there, we're already working on the next schedule. And constantly, it's a lot of work. And I think there's another school of thought that says, well, if we went to 3 schedules a year, could we actually be doing a lot more changes at once? And sort of what is the value of changing the schedules? I would say it's back as like, what is the value that and not to say there isn't the value of doing that? Is there another way to get there? But and essentially, I think that what's been most interesting for, I think, the T throughout the pandemic and forging ahead is, and I think this is true of many organizations, is everything we thought we couldn't do quickly or fast, we've had to do over the past 12 months, right? We built something like 4 or 5 different schedules last spring, some of which got published, some of which didn't. And I think we're all thinking through transit has never always been known for their flexibility, but I think we've all tried to say is like what we've taken as rules and things we can't change. I think we've all tried to be a lot more flexible thinking. And I, for one, am very excited to see how we continue bringing that thinking into a post-pandemic world. So I'm not sure if that was the answer you're looking for Andy, but to say is like, if we're looking for more flexibility in the system, I'm all ears, whether or not that's more than 4 schedules, we'll see, but I think would love to talk more.
Like I said, it's a wild idea. Thank you for entertaining it.
Thanks, Kat. Thanks, Andy. It looks like Caitlyn's raised her hand.
Sorry, just one more thing. I just wanted to jump on what he said, just to say that, you know, communicating with the public around these thresholds and around what's happening. And I know you guys have the Right Safer campaign, and I know you guys are doing, honestly, the best that you can. So I don't want you to take this as criticisms, but I think we all want riders to come back, which is really essential for our system redesign, in particular regional rail. So, you know, somehow thinking about getting that message out there, Pat, around the service being there, that there's actually 80%, so that people start to build back their confidence and feel like they can actually go back to public transit when they're thinking about going back to the workforce is super important. That's all.
Thanks, Caitlin. I think that matches too with our employer and rider surveys, trying to understand why people haven't been riding. And is it sort of their destination is closed, or is it perceptions of safety or perceptions of service? And it's I think it's been something we'll continue to mine and try to understand as we begin to restore service over the next year or 2.
Great, thanks, Kat. So those are all of the, and thank you, Caitlin, for that feedback as well. Those are all of the questions and comments that I see on the chat, and I don't see any raised hands, so I'll turn things back over to Erin.
All right. So, I mean, if no one else has any questions, I don't have any questions right now. Then I just recommend or encourage folks to submit their comments by next Tuesday, March 2nd. And I prefer, you know, just a direct email to me. I posted my email address in the chat and also posted a link to our public comment portal for those people that want to submit comments anonymously. And then I think there's additional information on the MBTA's website for this ENF form for submitting comments.
Yeah, Erin, the page that has the ENF, our webpage has the ENF and all the sections, at the bottom has all of the commenting information, your email, the public portal, my email address, all that stuff.
Great,
So,
awesome.
Okay. All right.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you
for the feedback.
for answering all of our questions.
All right, everyone, thank you so much. We appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Have a nice evening. Thanks to all of you who stayed on.
Yes.